Hi and welcome to Netweather.tv's official winter forecast with me, Stewart Rampling. Before we go into the forecast, I'd like to introduce this concept of a seasonal forecast contract. And what we mean by that is that seasonal forecasts, you've seen a lot of them in the press, the media, but not all of them good in our opinion. Others very good. But what we'd like to sort of get over is this concept that these forecasts are really a product of key assumptions that we make about the atmosphere, the state of the atmosphere going into the winter. And we should attempt to learn from them because they're a product of scientific analysis and reason. And we attempt to predict the sort of dynamical process between the ocean and the atmosphere. So if we make key assumptions about the atmosphere, A plus B plus C equals a seasonal forecast D, then if A, B and C come off, then the likelihood is that the seasonal forecast will be correct. However, if one or more of those are wrong, the likelihood is that the seasonal forecast will also be wrong. But it's important that we establish where it went wrong or where it went right, so that we can learn from it for the future. Okay, so moving on to the forecast now. Calling it a Winter of Two Halves. Overall we think average, slightly below average, so that would make it certainly another cold feeling winter. Not as cold as 2009 or 2010, and with some noticeable mild phases, particularly sort of up front, the front end of the winter, December, early part of January. Current thinking is December will be average or slightly above, January will be average, maybe slightly below, and February will be the coldest year. So becoming progressively colder from the second half of the winter onwards. And there's quite a strong signal there for a below average February. Rainfall, quite pertinent at the moment, close to average we think, generally quite possibly wetter in the southern part of England. So let's look at that in terms of differences in temperature from the normal. We can see main part here, colder part of Scandinavia. That's in conflict with a lot of the models and also some of the seasonal forecasts out there, which are predicting quite warm conditions to last throughout the winter in Scandinavia. We think that'll reverse during January and February. Colder conditions, Iberia, Spain, Portugal, and also parts of Africa. Warmer in the southeast Mediterranean, and the UK and parts of northwest Europe average or close to or slightly below. If we look at that in terms of air pressure, differences from normal, you can see here high pressure in Scandinavia. That's the main thing. Again, that's in conflict with what a lot of the models are telling us is going to happen this winter. Low pressure centred over France, certain parts of the UK. And again, that's conflicting with what some of the models are telling us. If we look in terms of the jet stream, this high altitude stream of winds, you can see this southern arm of the jet looping down towards Africa, creating this low pressure over Europe, and a northerner split jet stream in effect going up into the Arctic over Iceland. That's generating that high pressure, or ridge, as we call it, over Scandinavia. And at times, we could be looking at easterly winds coming in off the continent, bringing colder air. So if we look at how this forecast was produced, we've made a number of key assumptions. The first one being is what's going to happen in the Pacific Ocean with something called La Nina. And this is colder than normal waters, which can affect the overall circulation of the weather patterns across the planet. And this year we think it's going to be a weak category event, in contrast to last year, which was a strong category event, and that brought about that, or played a part in that very, very cold December pattern, but then milder from January onwards. So it's almost like a mirror, a reverse image of what happened last year. We've also taken quite a heavy account of what's happened this autumn. This has been one of the warmest autumns on record, and looking at the pressure patterns that brought that warm weather, mild weather about, and how they have a bearing going into the winter. We've also taken account of how the upper atmosphere is going to behave. That's the atmosphere over the Arctic, so 20-30 kilometres up in the air, and how that will have a bearing on, particularly in terms of pressure patterns over the Arctic and how those affect Northern Europe. We've also taken account of long-range computer models such as the CFS, the climate forecast system, which Netweather use, and also other computer models as well. Take you through a couple of notes we've made on this year. Now when we prepare these forecasts, we talk in terms of analogues. These are years where we have similar aspects to the key assumptions we're making now. And it's quite striking really, when we looked at those analogues, and you can look at different variables, no matter how you sort of cut them up, they always tended to come out with the same sort of trend, that trend being sort of mild start, relatively benign start, but becoming cooler, colder as the winter goes on. Now there's some uncertainty as to the timing of that shift from milder conditions, of Atlantic conditions in December, to much colder, blocked or high pressure over Scandinavian conditions. Current thinking probably be some mid to late January. That timing's open to a little bit of doubt, and if it happens earlier, then January will be colder than average. If it happens later on, then January will be milder than average or close to average. And we think the Arctic's going to have a huge role to play, particularly something called the stratosphere, the high atmosphere, in determining where that cold weather is going to come from. We think this year that cold is going to come from the east rather than the north, which it did in last year. And despite all that sort of talk of Atlantic weather patterns and rain and perhaps snow in February, rainfall close to average we think, possibly a little bit above in southern England, but really that's not really going to do an awful lot of good for the winter recharge of groundwater and reservoirs in particular. So there's potential issues going into the summer, spring next year in terms of water shortages.